Get ready to rock with David Randall, playing all the best in rock music just for you.
Do you think if you'd have held things together, Clark, in the 1990s and beyond, I know the 1990s, as you've already mentioned, it was a difficult time for a lot of bands. You know, the industry was changing. Do you think, you know, if you had have persisted, you could have had perhaps a more durable career in the band context, equivalent, say, to a band like perhaps Duran Duran?
It's a really tough one because, you know, there's also Depeche Mode would be a good example as well.
Yes.
And you've got to think about the fact that Depeche Mode and Duran Duran emerged in the earlier part of the 80s. So they had a lot more time to establish themselves before the 90s arrived and everything changed. So I think they also could endure that time and survive that time because they had built already a very strong following. I don't think Johnny Hates Jazz had enough time, seeing as Shattered Dreams was a hit in 1987, and our first hit in the US was not until 1988, which was Shattered Dreams again. So it's difficult to know. Yes, I think it's very possible we would have endured and built quite a strong career for ourselves, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself, well, a lot of these things depend upon other factors, and that is, you know, how the band get on interpersonally, if, you know, they can overcome differences or not. And every band has, you know, there's always differences. That's inevitable. You know, you're essentially like a family, and those kind of things are going to surface now and again. But with Johnny Hates Jazz, I just don't think, through the combination of the factors I just mentioned, I don't think it probably would have held together anyway. That said, is there a sense of regret? Yes, there is, to a degree. I think regret is quite a natural thing. I'm not someone who goes through life saying, you know, I don't regret anything. Well, I think it's a very uncritical way of looking at your own life. But I do regret to an extent, and there's a song on Magnetized called The Road Not Taken, which is really a song about releasing yourself from that sense of regret. Because it's a painful thing to carry with you. I think we all have things in our lives we look back on and think we could have done differently, and those things can haunt us and weigh us down if we're not careful. So it's important to acknowledge, yep, I could have done things differently, I could have done things better, but I was young and I had a lot to learn, and I'm on a good path now, and that's really what The Road Not Taken is about.
Oh, it's fantastic. Now, let's talk about the 1990s, because you did make several solo albums, which I'm certainly going to go off and try and find. But I have to say, one of them, Clark, I notice Fishing for Souls, 1992. It's £399 on Amazon.
Yeah, well, the original version is...
That isn't you, is it?
No, it's not me. It's not me, no. Actually, that album was for sale for £500 at one point, just a couple of years ago. Actually, far be it from me to steal the thunder of whoever is selling that bootleg copy for that amount of money, but you can download it from iTunes or Amazon, in its entirety. Yeah, Fishing for Souls became a rarity because it wasn't formally released. It was just at a time when my relationship with Virgin Records hit an all-time low, and Virgin was actually being sold to EMI at the time, as all of the British labels were going through. They were all being sold off to international interests, and there was a falling out between myself and Virgin, and the album wasn't put out, but was bootlegged somehow. So it became a bit of developed a bit of a cult following until I managed to get my control of the album again and release it myself. I was very happy with the album. There's a song on there called Broken Spirit, which really was destined to be a Johnny Hates Jazz single had I stayed in the band. So anyone who listens to it probably will hear that in the recording. Well,
that's interesting. I mean, we should mention the other albums. I mean, that evidently is a rarity, really, Fishing for Souls. But there's 1990s Rain Dance, and then a more recent album, Tomorrow, in 2007. Could I ask you, Clark, I mean, if listeners go investigating these solo albums, maybe not paying nearly £400 for one of them, but they, as you say, they can download these. But will they hear Johnny Hates Jazz in some of the music?
Yeah, inevitably they will, because as a writer, that really is who I am. You know, you're perhaps thinking more of, when you listen to the solo stuff, especially Tomorrow, the album Tomorrow, you will hear times of some Johnny Hates Jazz isms, but that's really because it's my voice, obviously, and my songwriting, so it's never that far away. But that said, I think we hear more of it on Rain Dance, because that was shortly after Johnny Hates Jazz, and there were a couple of songs that were destined to be on a future Johnny Hates Jazz album on Rain Dance, and I think that you'll find some familiarity there. Tomorrow took many, many years to make, and is an entirely different being altogether. That's an album that does have a very clear environmental and spiritual focus, but even through that, sonically and musically, you're going to hear moments that you'll think to yourself, well, that is clearly that guy from Johnny Hates Jazz. There's a track on Tomorrow called Nothing Left to Lose, which was really my first foray back into the realm of Johnny Hates Jazz, which preceded writing Magnetized, actually.
Ah, so there are some connections. It sounds like we do all need to go investigating these, you know, to build the complete picture, really. Just to sum up, really, I mean, you're on the eve of playing a series of dates in March 2016. What about getting back playing live? Because you haven't really done many live dates in recent times. You know, you've done sort of big events like the festivals we've mentioned. They've been peppered around, really. But how easy is it getting back to playing live? You know,
it's actually technically it's more of a challenge, because you want, you know, when we make records, I know, again, a lot of musicians say this, and it sounds a bit of a soundbite now, but we are perfectionists, and we do like to get things to sound as good as possible. And in the live environment, unless you've got a lot of resource and a lot of time, that's sometimes challenging. But we work really hard to do that, and that's one of the great things about having Mike on the team, because the engineering part of him comes to the fore there as well. But it really, it goes back to the songs. Essentially, what do you start with? Well, you start with X number of songs for, you know, however long the set is going to be, and you have to find a way to communicate those songs effectively, knowing that it's not supposed to be exactly like the record. At the same time, you know, the records sounded the way they did, and people like that, and we like that, so we just kind of have to find that middle ground between it sounding exactly like the record, but it's sounding fresh in a way that is exciting for people to hear it in a live context. So it's actually really enjoyable. We've got a great bunch of players with us as well, really, really good people. So I think people who come along to the shows will really enjoy it. It's really good energy.
And they can expect a real cross-section of the new stuff and the classic stuff from the 80s, presumably.
Well, we're playing most of the Turn Back the Clock album.
Oh, this is good. Yes.
Not all of it. We thought, you know, it's good to just leave one or two back, you know, for a rainy day. But and some of the Magnetized stuff as well. So yeah, it's interesting to hear them all together, because they really do fit. They sound like they're from the same album in many ways, from a songwriting perspective. But there's a lot of audience participation, put it that way.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah. I mean, can I just ask you, did you do many tours back in the day, you know, back when you were having that massive success with the album and the singles?
We did a lot of promotion, which meant playing live in different situations. But no, we didn't do any touring, because I left before that could happen.
Ah, right.
Pre-Johnny Hates Jazz, I had done a lot of live work. Calvin had done a lot of live work. Mike had done quite a bit, actually. So we'd all independently done quite a bit. But as Johnny Hates Jazz, that we weren't together long enough to create the tour situation. And we have to remember that, again, in the 1980s, studio work ruled. Studio musicians were the most prevalent. Tours were not what they are now. Tours are now enormous. They're incredibly sought after and in demand. Back then it was records.
Yeah.
So you kind of did a tour on, as not as an afterthought, but it certainly was not the top of the list. So we didn't think back on that time, or I certainly didn't, and think, wow, we should have toured. That was that was an absolute must. No, the absolute must was making the best records we could. Now, of course, it's different, and it's very enjoyable. It's a very enjoyable difference, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you've actually put your finger on. That's another fundamental difference that we should remember. Really, that the studio-based stuff, and of course, most bands now make their living off the gigs, don't they? They have to tour, especially as there aren't big budgets and all the rest of it. But that's the other point to make, really, Clark, is that this tour and hopefully future tours. I mean, it's really a chance to see the band live for the very first time, isn't it?
It is for a lot of people, for most people, actually, yeah. And in a fairly intimate setting. We're not playing big theatres here, and that was a deliberate move, really, to reintroduce ourselves to the live circuit. So it's going to. I don't think it'll stay that way. I think we're going to do other things later in the year and next year as well. Already we're planning on that too. I think it's going to be a much larger scale. So it's a great situation to come to kind of have a much more personal experience of who and what Johnny Hates Jazz is.